Hello, and welcome to our session, Four Zones of Professional Learning, Fostering Equity in Gifted Programs. My name is Katie Lewis, and I'm an associate professor at York College of Pennsylvania, and I'm here today with my colleague and co-creator, Angela Novak. Angela?
Hi, everybody. My name is Angela Novak. I'm from East Carolina University in North Carolina, and I am excited to be here with you today. I am going to kick off our presentation with a little bit of prior assumption, prior knowledge that we are going to assume in terms of where we're going to start. And that just means that we are not going to dive into these concepts in a lot of depth. If you are not familiar with these things, you can always press pause if it's an on-demand session and go hang out with some of the other sessions and come back if you have gotten a little bit more familiar with the concepts. If not, you can always keep on going with the session. It's not going to make or break this session. It's just these are some things that we're not going to go into a lot of depth on. So some of those prior assumptions are that there are general characteristics of gifted and talented learners. These are generalizations, meaning that they come from the research and that they have been understood in terms of the research, but they are generalizations, meaning they don't apply to every child, and that gifted youth do not always exhibit every single one of these characteristics. So there are variations within them. In many districts, another assumption is that teachers are gatekeepers to gifted programs. This is seen in two primary ways, though there are more ways, absolutely. And this is that sometimes teachers are the initial referral for screening, so that is that first step. And also that they provide recommendations or checklists. And so they can be a second or even sometimes a last step to get into a gifted program or to provide services. There also are some recommendations in terms of current research for gifted services and for for teachers in terms of gifted programming. And that is that professional learning is critical for educators. And it should cover some specific characteristics that can pertain especially to marginalized gifted youth in terms of the characteristics that are expressed in terms of giftedness and the strategies that can be used to support students that are from traditionally marginalized communities. Professional learning in general, but even more specifically for teachers of gifted students, should be purposely planned, should follow research-based best practices. And in doing so, it can improve both the recognition of underserved students, the referrals into the gifted program, and in the longer term, retention of students that have been historically marginalized in these gifted and talented programs. And so the model that Katie and I have worked on for several years now is a research-based model, and it is what you see on the screen, and it is a method. It's a four-zone method of creating those three things that I just mentioned, and it is helping to both not both, but it helps to recognize, it helps to increase referrals, and it helps to retain students. And it goes through 4 different zones. As I mentioned, it is based on research, and you can see the theoretical frameworks in the model, and the core of the model is these theoretical frameworks. And so the first zone of the model seeks to raise awareness of the inequities in the student populations. And this is through this targeted professional learning. So it is a model that is really deeply entrenched in professional learning, as you can tell from the title of the model. And this first zone is really beginning equity work, understanding the self, the community, the system. And one thing that we'll talk about a little bit is something that Paul Gorski says, and he's one of the theoretical frameworks that we use. And this is that you can't start a discussion with if racism exists in this space, but by naming how it does. And that if you're starting by debating the if, you're not ready to have the conversation. You start by naming the how. The second zone connects the culture to the manifestation of giftedness, as well as the impact of the systemic inequities on a student's educational experience. The third zone focuses on ways to provide support to the teachers and the students before and after identification to mitigate and provide reparations against the inequities. And finally, the fourth zone focuses on making connections with the families and communities of the marginalized populations. So these zones are meant to be cycled through in an iterative process, which you can see by the arrows that go up and down, and the curly Q arrows as well. And then as the teachers need more professional learning in the different topics, they go through in that process. And so it creates a rotation of ongoing support that lead to systemic change. And so that's the idea there in terms of the full model. So Katie is going to walk you through a potential case study, which we're going to use to walk through each of these zones in more detail.
So this is an example of maybe a case study that you might have in your own school. So you could use an actual scenario of students that you have in your classroom, or you can use a fictional student. So if we look at Shiloh here, you would want your teachers to look at this student and decide if they would refer the student or not refer the student for gifted and talented identification. So Shiloh lives with his grandmother on the reservation. He does not plan to pursue college, and as he prefers to stay closely and work with the elders. His standardized test scores are in the top 5%, but between his attendance record and performance in the classroom, the teachers are considering retaining him. Shiloh seems to enjoy math class, where he easily makes connections between mathematical concepts and calculates complex problems in his head. He stays after class to ask questions to learn more about the concepts. If you just read this scenario, most people are going to say, let's not refer this child, right? But then we think maybe we should. So we're going to walk through our 4 zones, starting with the zone 1, where we should begin. So in zone 1, we are looking to increase our understanding of the cultural norms in equity. And this is really important because before a teacher is able to really understand other cultures, we have to first look back at our own culture and think about our own lived experiences and how those are influencing what we see. So during this zone, we would work with our teachers to talk about, Shiloh's situation, right? So Shiloh is a Native American. In front of our indigenous population. So we would have some professional development talking about how is this population seen in our culture and what are some characteristics of it. I think one of the first things to kind of highlight is that there's over 566 tribes that are nationally recognized. And so when we see a student, we can't just assume they're all the same. They have many different cultural differences and some different dialects depending on which tribal group you're coming from. It's also important to note that this is one of our least researched groups of students within the field of gifted education. So there's not a whole lot of support for our cultural group out there. So in this zone, we would first reflect, we would lead our teachers through some awareness training and thinking about how my perceptions are influencing my beliefs and understandings of these children in our classroom. We're just going to kind of jump through the zones because we only have about 15 minutes left. So Angela, do you want to do zone 2?
Yeah, absolutely. So as we go out of zone 1 and into zone 2, the big shift is from understanding the self and the cultural norms and equity into understanding how giftedness presents in that new in this different cultural group. And so when we when we move into from zone 1 into zone 2, a really important understanding to have of your students, or of your teachers in this case, not of your students, is, are they there? And so throughout this process, remember this is an iterative process. It's really important to take the pulse of your participants of professional learning, because that know thyself that Katie mentioned in zone 1, and that self-understanding is incredibly important, and understanding where they are in that process. That zone 1 can take a long time and that breaking down can take a long time, because there has to be a good understanding there so that they can be very respectful, and your participants are ready to move on to zone 2. And this is again where this iterative process can be a jumping forward and then jumping back and moving around. In terms of our example group, there are some characteristics of gifted Indigenous groups that may be what are atypical, considering those lists that your teachers maybe have studied in the past or previous professional learning experiences have offered. So they may go through and use a reference like Tamara Fisher's work, for example, and this is a blog work that she's done that's posted on some blogs that she has, and we can certainly provide the links if you'd like to touch base with us. But so some of her work says that, again, and this is generalized, so depending certainly on the Native American tribal group that you are working with, but students might be curious but not always question asking. They may have a wait and watch and learn approach rather than a question and learn. Whereas if you look at a typical checkoff list for gifted characteristics, you are looking for a question asker, right? Someone who's very curious, someone who is raising their hand and wanting to ask the question, or even interrupting class to ask the question. And this student may wait until after class to ask any questions, is seeming like they need help rather than the student that you're typically looking for. This student may also have aspirations for the contributions they want to make to the tribal group, to the reservation. And the student that a teacher may be typically thinking of is a student who wants to move up and out. This is also a characteristic of rurality, a student who wants to return home to their sense of place and come back to the community, rather than what a teacher might think of as, I want to save this child and get them out of the situation they're currently in. And so this is again where the teacher, the people who are working with the students need to be very aware of who they are and what they're bringing into this place, and not putting their perception onto the groups at hand. And so they're not trying to rescue the child out of what is what they may see as a negative situation, but supporting the child where they are. So in this case, when we're understanding the characteristics and how giftedness manifests in these different cultural groups or different from themselves, then this is really important in terms of understanding ourselves and understanding and recognizing the assets and the strengths of the community and cultures of the world of the students that we are servicing, and recognizing that what their community and culture brings are assets, are strengths, and this is how giftedness manifests in each of them.
So in zone 3 then, we have identified our populations. And so now the focus is how can we increase our classroom support for our educators? Because we don't want our students to be identified and then feel like they don't fit and then they drop out. Or perhaps it's an ESL student that has been identified and you get into the gifted program, but the gifted curriculum and the programming hasn't been adjusted for an ESL student. So for zone 3, here the focus is presenting professional development for our teachers that's really focusing on those supports for both the teacher and for the student. And this can range from everything from mentorships, so pairing a identified student with another indigenous population student, so he has someone who looks like him, looking for mentors both within the school, so within the curriculum and within our program, but also those out in the community who can come in and be leaders within the field. And this is really important. It's also important to allow opportunities for students to self-reflect and to not prompt, but to answer prompts and to really think about how they're feeling and be able to share and have that positive relationship with their teacher. Teachers also need supports though. So what supports can we provide the teacher in the classroom? And what can we use that we already have, but maybe we're not thinking about using? If we're thinking about an ESL student, a lot of times our gifted classroom teacher doesn't think to go grab the ESL teacher and say, hey, can you come help me? How can I adapt this for this student? So definitely want to use our resources that we have available to us and as we move through. And this part is going to look a little bit different depending on where you are and what the particular needs are. But it's really, really important because we want to have our students not only be identified, but also retained. And one thing you could do is also front load, so identify our students a little bit earlier. So setting up in our kindergarten, our preschools, programs that are going to provide them some of those experiences and some of those skills for creative thinking and that they may not otherwise have. So those are all great opportunities. I think we have about 5 more minutes. So let's move on to zone 4.
Believe it or not, that actually means we're kind of on time. That's good for us. So in zone 4, this is increasing and developing partnerships with parents and the community. And this pretty well connects with zone 2. And a lot of this has to do with looking at the community without that deficit lens, which is really common in teaching and in the community, or far too common actually, and making sure we're looking and viewing and developing partnerships with the community with a strengths-based and asset-based lens, and not just a lens, but wholeheartedly, truly. And that is learning from, in terms of our Shiloh example, but learning from the elders and the tribal culture and their views on giftedness and respecting those views, altering language if you need to. If the person in the community, the one true person is gifted, is the shaman, don't use the word gifted. I understand that's the word that the program uses. Change the word. If that is a roadblock, alter your language, because you don't need to use that word. You can use talented, you can use highly capable, you can use other language that doesn't create a roadblock between your community and your program. And so adjust things so you're not creating a situation where you have a linguistical or communication discrepancy. So make adjustments, be respectful of the community that you're working with, and recognize the assets, the strengths, the funds of knowledge, the community wealth that the community has, and bring it into the classroom, bring it into the school as much as possible, and or recognize if there is a previous history of poor relationships, be comfortable with bringing school events outside of the school and making those, I don't want to say concessions, but making those collaborative decisions as well. So engaging community and parents in the school events, but making sure that atmosphere is one of collaboration, not one of who is going to win um, this this decision, right? It's not one of a zero-sum game. And making sure that the parent workshops and learning opportunities and support you're providing are in a environment of collaboration and teamwork. One of the methods that we have used in our work, and that you can read in the publications that we have about the 4-zone method, is Funds of Knowledge, and that's a great resource in terms of thinking about home visits, asset-based relationships, and that kind of thing. But it's really about this idea of partnerships and creating this idea of community. And so that's a real part of that asset-based lens. And so I'm going to give it back to Katie. I started by introducing the model, and so I'll let her close us out with the model.
So as we go back and we think about the model, and we have the 4 zones that we briefly went through, it's important to keep in mind that it is an iterative process, right? So sometimes you're gonna be able to move faster through some zones, and other times you're gonna get through it, and then you're gonna realize, oh, we really need to double back, and so you'll double back. And that's important because I think sometimes when we start doing professional learning, we feel like we're just checking off our squares and like, I got this year, I'll get it next year. But it's more of an ongoing process. That is really, monitored along the way. And we have another session, if you haven't checked it out, where we talk about guiding principles for professional development. And so those are really important to keep in mind as well as you go through. And we believe strongly that this model, based in theoretical frameworks and equity and culturally responsive learning, is successful, and it does work, because we do find that teachers have changed, right? We have change in our mindsets. And this also has a positive change in increasing the identification of marginalized populations, but also the retention of those populations in our classroom. But I think we're out of time. Thank you so much for joining us. And we're happy to chat. If you have other questions later, please reach out to us.
Yeah. And the other session that Katie mentioned is the other session in this block. So we are 2 of the 3 sessions in this block. So hang out with us.
Bye.